Hi everyone, my name is Catherine. I'm with Research Rockstar, and today we're going to talk about data. And a little more specifically, today we're going to talk about bias in data. Those of us who are professionals in the market research and customer insight space spend a lot of time making sure that we eliminate bias from our projects so that when we deliver our analysis and inspire those insights, that we can be sure that we're giving the most objective insights possible, that we're really delivering objective data. Now, as professionals in this space, there are a few different things that we do to mitigate the risk of bias. Unfortunately, there are a lot of different sources of bias that come up. Now, there are many, many more sources of bias than are listed on this slide, but just as a way of sort of categorizing the types of bias we typically think about as professionals in the market research and customer insight space, one source of bias is participant bias. Is there something about our instruments? Is there something in our data collection process that is perhaps preventing people from being as objective and candid with us as possible? And we also know that there are certain forms of participant bias that are really hard to control. For example, social desirability bias. Yes, there are things we can do to make sure that we mitigate the risk, but it's a really hard thing. There are many different types of bias. There's also researcher bias. It's true. Once we get data, we can't help but interpret it through a lens of our own past experiences. Now, sometimes those past experiences are really helpful. After all, things we've learned from past projects and maybe other industries we've worked with can be applied to the benefit of a current project. But we do have to be careful, especially about this bias of confirmation bias. We tend to see what we hope to see in our data. So if I've got a really strong hypothesis, even as an objective researcher, I can't help but try to confirm my hypothesis. It can be harder for me to reject a hypothesis of my own. So we know that we tend to see in our data things that confirm our personal points of view and hypotheses before we see things that may not confirm that. Now again, as professional market researchers and customer insights professionals, we have ways of mitigating that through structured and rigorous analysis. But that does take a lot of discipline. So one of the things that's really interesting is that a lot of the times when we're talking about bias, and the types of bias we're talking about here has to do with the bias that gets introduced during a research project. So what's happening as we're collecting those customer attitudes, client opinions, their associations, and what's happening as we're analyzing the data. But the truth is that there's another source of bias that comes earlier, and that's the bias that comes from the methodology and data sources that we use. So even before we actually start doing a research project, could we be introducing bias by the type of data we're collecting, the source of the data that we're using, the methodology we choose? One of my concerns these days is in making sure that all of the professionals in our career are being data agnostic. That is, that we are avoiding being biased in what methods we choose. Now, we can't help it to some extent, right? Because there are certain methods that we all have used for years. We're comfortable with them. We're experts in them. So it's really easy to rely on those methods. But these days, business decision makers, the people who are typically paying for market research projects, have many different data sources available to them, a lot of different specialists, a lot of different experts, frankly, a lot of different research methodologies. So I want to make sure that we're being data agnostic so that when a client comes to us and asks us for a project, that we are recommending the best data source and the best methodology, even if it's ones that we may not be completely comfortable with. So let's find out how data agnostic we already are. And let's take a look at a question. A little bit of a self-test here. So let's say you are working on a project where your goal is to prioritize among 10 possible product features in a new virtual reality headset. What data sources or methods would you recommend? Okay, so a client comes to me and says, hey, we're introducing a new virtual reality headset. We've got ideas for 10 possible new features or attributes for this product. How are we going to prioritize among them? Which ones are going to be the most important? Which ones could maybe either wait to a future release or maybe not get added at all? All right, so if a client came to you with this type of objective, what methodology would come to mind? Focus groups? Surveys? Some of you probably said in-depth interviews. Some of you might have even said ethnography. Well, I'd like to do some ethnography to understand how people are currently using virtual reality headsets. And those are all certainly viable options, right? So these are some of the tools that we have in our tool chest that we have a lot of expertise with, and they all may be options. However, there are other options as well. So I want to make sure that when we're looking at a question like this, we don't just default to say surveys and focus groups, or even ethnography or in-depth interviews. I want to make sure we look at all of our choices. So for example, there could be some existing in-house data that I could leverage for that. Are there other existing models of virtual reality headset that this company has that already has some of these features? Can we look at some sales figures to understand which of these different models have sold better or worse, right? Is there anything that I can kind of look at to see if I can infer which features seem to help sell a product and which ones don't seem to have an impact? So I might look to see if there's some existing data. I might also do something that's more of a simulation, right? Where I do some sort of online simulation or online projective technique to really understand what people are likely to do if they were actually making a purchase of different models, some of which have different feature sets than others. So there could be different ways that I get at something like this. I might even want to do other types of research to understand their gaming behavior. Maybe I want to have one of these really scalable online qual tools so that people can take a diary for me over the period of a few weeks. Maybe taking videos of themselves or of their situations, or just doing sort of video diary entries of their experiences using their existing virtual reality headset and any challenges they may have using it. So there are a lot of different options. What's going to be the best option for this case? Well, obviously there's a lot of information we don't have in this 30-second case study. We don't know whether or not they've already been selling virtual reality headsets and have existing data. We don't know if they also already have access to some secondary data. Maybe somebody's already published some research about virtual reality headsets that we can acquire. We don't know whether or not they're planning on using this data to create prototypes. We don't know, frankly, what their budget and timeline is. So based on all of those things, that's going to lead us to a recommendation of what specific data sources and methods are likely to be the best. But again, I'm just trying to make sure I'm doing a good job of not defaulting to the methods that I am most comfortable with. These days, the truth is that business decision makers have a lot of different data sources available to them. Some of them come from their market research departments or suppliers. Some of them come from other sources and other types of specialists. But we have to recall that these days, people are very aware that they have a lot of different data options. Business decision makers know that they have other options beyond surveys and focus groups, and even in-depth interviews and ethnographies. They have people who are coming at them who are offering different types of customer analytics. They have people coming at them who are offering access directly to different kinds of social media listening tools that could perhaps be used to uncover sources of pain. They may have access to past purchase data from various sources. So people have all these different options these days. These are just a few different ways of framing all of the different data options that business decision makers these days really do have access to. They can be looking at primary or secondary data, big data or small data, structured or unstructured data. They might have access to scanner data. So there are all of these different ways of thinking about data sources and data methodologies. So if you took our little test and you found yourself thinking, well, if I want to prioritize 10 features for a new product that either feels like a focus group or a survey to me, it might be a good idea to refresh and learn about some of the new methodologies that are available so that you can bring to your client all of the best options and not just to default to the ones that we have used traditionally in the market research field. So this also relates to a topic that I've discussed with folks recently, which is about the value of self-reported data versus observed data. So when business decision makers are talking to other experts, one of the messages that they're hearing from some of the other experts is that if you're talking to people about products, it's hard for people to tell you what they want, right? A lot of people will, use the famous Ford quote of, if I'd asked people what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse, right? But that doesn't allow for is the fact that there are a lot of different sources of data. So I want to make sure that as part of this conversation about what's the best methodology to recommend to make sure I'm being really data agnostic, I really do need to make sure I'm thinking carefully about, is this a topic that I can trust self-reported data for, or do I need other sources of data? Now, the virtual reality headset case is really interesting because it's a fairly new market. And one of the things we know about fairly new markets is if you ask people about feature requirements, it's still a little too hypothetical. Unless you're only collecting data from the early adopters, it's really hard to find from the mainstream market what they're going to want. If you ask them and throw out a lot of features, they don't have enough experience with the category to really give informed opinions. Does it capture attitudes? Yes. But I would be hesitant to report that type of data as being indicative of what types of features are going to help a product sell in the future. So there are cases like with new product categories where I do want to make sure that not only am I being agnostic in what methodology I use, I want to be really honest with myself. Is this a topic for which self-reported data is just not a fit at all? And I really should focus on those methods and options that don't require me to ask questions and get answers. Maybe there's an observational method or an alternate data source I can use so that I'm not too dependent on, frankly, some of the challenges of self-reported data when we're talking about product requirements and new product categories. So I hope that this particular topic is one that's useful to everybody. I really encourage you to talk to your colleagues and your friends in this industry about what we can do to make sure that we are being data agnostic. I want to make sure that when you are making recommendations to your clients, that your clients realize that you're not just somebody who only knows surveys and focus groups. I want them to trust you as their data agnostic advisor, that they know that you're the person they can go to for recommendations about different data sources and different methods that will meet their needs, and that you are somebody who knows about all of the various different options so that they can rely on you for those recommendations. So I hope this was a useful conversation. For those of you who may have colleagues who are trying to become more data fluent and more familiar with different data options, I'd like to suggest that you take a look at our data fluency course. This is a course that's offered 3 times a year at Research Rockstar, and you can check it out here on our training catalog at training.researchrockstar.com. And as always, if you have any questions or comments, please welcome them. Please do submit them. I welcome them. And please do subscribe and like us if you like us. Thanks, everyone.